Want to say a warm welcome to my dear friend, Rabbi David Wolpe. Welcome to everybody who's joining us from near and far on this Alel Shavuot. For Rabbi Wolpe, it's a little bit earlier. It's the dinner hour. For us, it's just the beginning, right after Ma'ariv. And I just want to say, by way of introduction, in the little less than an hour we'll have together this evening, that there'll be an opportunity to ask questions into the chat, and we'll see if we can have some of those a little later on. I have some questions for the conversation that Rabbi Wolpe and I are going to have, but okay, we're now on Facebook. Good. All right, we're streaming live. Rabbi David Wolpe, depending on whether you go by the definition of Newsweek and Time, or the major networks, or any Jewish source, they'll all tell you that Rabbi Wolpe is the best we have in the rabbinate. I actually will heartily concur. And he has this remarkable capacity for making Judaism attractive, for its ideas to make its ideas come to life. And personally, he's a friend for a long time who helps challenge me to think more deeply and more broadly. Without further ado, a warm welcome to Rabbi David Wolpe.
I was going to say it's great to be here, but the truth is I'm here. It's like it's great to be in this room of my home as opposed to that room of my home. No, it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
So,
thank you, David.
As always. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate your taking the time. We are honored to have you. So the first question I want to ponder with you relates to events, obviously, over the last week or so, very painful events in Israel, over the skies of Israel, of course, painful events in Hamas-dominated Gaza as well. And I guess the question I have has to do with how interesting it is, or not interesting, how demanding it is on us to have to constantly go back again and again and again to say some of the same things we've been saying for years, to support Israel, our personal friends, to make contact with them, to support the lawmakers whose courage in standing up for Israel is costlier than the lawmakers for whom it's not as costly, and to challenge those who have an approach to history that likes to turn history into putty. In a real sense, I guess the question I came up against this week was, you mean I have to say again that it's appropriate for Israel to be able to respond, to defend her citizenry? How often?
I wrote to a friend somewhat kiddingly. It's like, if Hamas knew how much of my time this week they've taken up, I'm sure that they wouldn't have attacked Israel, because it's just, yes, it's exhausting. I mean, obviously, it is a lot better to do this in America than to face what our brothers and sisters in Israel are facing, and we certainly don't mean to make any equivalents. It's exhausting for defenders of Israel to have to make the same case over and over again, and even more dispiriting, it's a case that is less heard than it was even 15, 20 years ago. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Social media is part of it, and the general drift of anti-Western, anti-colonialism is part of it. But as you said, first of all, we have to try to shore up people on the right or on the left who are pro-Israel. And it's particularly, I think, important to shore up people on the left, because they're the ones who are fighting their own constituencies. People on the right generally are not. And also, even if you think you won't be heard, it's so important to say over and over and over again, no, I am not defending everything that Israel did. I actually think that they made a few pretty significant strategic errors in this confrontation. But the reaction to that It was to launch rockets at civilian targets and to try to kill as many people as possible. And so the moral imbalance is gigantic, and this, part of this is the price that we pay for actually being militarily stronger. Because if we were militarily weaker, the whole world, first of all, Israel would no longer exist, but also the world would be full of sympathy. But I don't think you can apologize for successfully defending yourself. So it's hard, but we have to continue to do it because it's part of the price that we pay. This sounds strange, but I know that you'll understand what I mean. It's part of the price that we pay for not living there.
Yeah.
That is, if you're not going to live in Israel and your children are not going to face the missiles, then you have to help the people who are in every way that you know how.
Right. Well said. I would add one more point, which is that maybe we need to treat it almost more effectively each time. That was the wake-up call for me, because when I was preparing a dispatch to our community last week, it was appropriately pointed out that I didn't articulate as strongly. I actually quoted you up at the top, by the way, in one of your tweets about the idea that if all this has to happen for it to stop is for them to stop raining rockets, it would stop. If Israel would stop defending itself and retaliating, it would be a slaughter, right?
Right.
The but the person who made the point was 100% right, because it occurs to me that just as the IDF has to get better and better at fighting the same front,
Right.
we have to get better and better at our game in terms of, because as you say, the things that we say today, if we'd said them 2 years ago, would have gone a little further. So we have to be
So
more.
true.
Yeah.
It's true, and it's also like when you see that people who have millions of followers are saying the most vile and ridiculous things about Israel, and if that's what you have to fight against, you have to fight against the sort of herd mentality of, well, if a celebrity says this, it must be true. Then it becomes difficult and painful. And also, you have to fight against your own sense of despair, because, as you said at the beginning, this happens again and again, and people die on both sides, and children die on both sides every time this happens. I heard today, I went briefly on to a conversation on Clubhouse, and Hussein Ibish, who's a brilliant guy, Palestinian American, and he's Palestinian, and he has sympathized with the Palestinians and so on. And they asked him about Hamas. How do you define Hamas? And he said, I define it as a disaster. He said it's a disaster because it religified the conflict, and because he thinks it encourages the right wing. And he said in Israel, and because, as he said, what happened was this was calming down. It was calming down on Friday. And Hamas realized that the youth of the Palestinian Authority and of Israeli Arabs were taking the lead in the conflict, and they didn't want that. They want to be seen as the one, so they started launching rockets. It was strategic to try to kill as many Israelis as they could. So what are we supposed to do with that?
Yeah, 100%. And I by the way, what I've written this weekend was essentially that this was a last-ditch effort by Hamas for not only to retain and restore relevance, but to slam into reverse, to yank into reverse all of the progress of the last 5 years or so, because that progress, including the raising of the esteem of Israelis who are Arabs and who are Muslims, especially after COVID, the normalization of Israel's existence in the region among Bahrain and the UAE and everything else, all that spells the extinction, essentially, of the cause that Hamas stands for. And so, in a very real sense, you can hook it on to anything you want, but this is them trying to literally put themselves back at the front and center, and and so we absolutely have to. It's that fascinating what Ibish has to say. I do want to ask you about the bedfellows, though, because it's interesting, because our friend Marty Friedman and others have written about the odd convergence of different groups that are completely at odds on everything else. You'll have progressive liberals and ferocious fundamentalists, people joining common cause in their positions against Israel. And of course, that's what anti-Semitism will do, is it'll not only pull Sunnis and Shiites
Right.
together in the case of Hamas support from Iran, but it'll pull together the hard left and groups like Hamas that have absolutely nothing in common with those groups, to say the least. But I wonder, David, if it might be the case that we may be missing something here. That is, we may be fantasizing that at some point they'll wake up to the idea of who they're in bed with and be kind of aghast. But I wonder if, in fact, they are actually okay with it, because they may tell themselves that it demonstrates that they are not so narrow and not so close-minded, that for a just cause in their minds, right, they are flexible enough to find common ground with those whose views they abhor. Do you think we're missing that?
It's possible. I mean, we certainly, we do that on our side. When we say, I don't care if you're on the left or you're on the right, support Israel. And people on the left and on the right sometimes abhor each other's views. So it is certainly possible. The irony, though, is that the central plank of the progressive left, which is the rights of women, for example, that which they're supposed to hold most dear, has very little purchase in the Islamic world, as we know. And so it's you may be right, but it's not puzzling, because it goes back to Tom Lehrer, in National Brotherhood Week, where he talks about all the different groups who hate each other, and then he ends up with everybody hates the Jews. It's not puzzling exactly in the sense that it's a long-standing phenomenon, but it is astonishing.
Yeah. Now I want to shift a little bit our attention, since it's Shavuot, and we're going to talk a little bit about Judaism as well. And you wrote a really important piece recently in the Jewish Review of Books that's gotten a fair amount of attention, that's been reflected on in different settings, about when you were looking back at the 20th century major thinkers of Judaism, where essentially everyone would agree for the first time in anybody's memory, certainly millennia, the whole question of what you believe and how you behave as a Jew was relevant, which it clearly was not for the Middle Ages and the various periods of antiquity. You wrote about these very interesting categories of Jews Jews of obligation and Judaism of obligation and Judaism of encouragement.
Right.
And I think it's a very, very interesting distinction that gives me a lot to think about as a fellow colleague from
Right.
JTS, as it gives me a lot of pause. But I also wonder about the whole notion of a fellowship of commitment and people who are committed in service of something beyond ourselves. We know that we actually get courage when we serve others. We're able to do more when we're serving something larger than ourselves. And so is that what's at the heart? I wonder if you could, first of all, just flesh out.
So I'll start,
then,
by elaborating the distinction that you mentioned at the beginning, which is, for most of Jewish history, when someone said, why do I have to do this? The answer was, because God told you. And there could be secondary answers too. That is, you could say, because it's good to practice kashrut because it keeps the Jewish people together, because these animals are really bad for your soul. I mean, you could give all sorts of reasons, but the fundamental reason was God told you not to eat a cheeseburger, so you don't eat a cheeseburger. In modern times, that changed. The example that I gave in the article was that Friday afternoon I was walking on Rodeo Drive. I think it was Rodeo, or somewhere right in like the heart of Beverly Hills-ish Beverly Hills. And I saw a bunch of my members at a restaurant outdoors. It's obviously before the pandemic. And so I came over and we were talking, and I said, I didn't realize that this was Friday afternoon, was the Sinai Temple in Beverly Hills. And one of them said, oh, this is nothing. You should see us on Saturday afternoon after synagogue. This is where we all come to have lunch. And it struck me that I could have given them all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't do that. I could say, you should have Shabbat at home, whatever. The reason that I could not give them is, but God said you can't. Because first of all, it didn't really occur to me to say that to them. And had it occurred to me, they wouldn't have believed it. It wouldn't have mattered. They don't believe that. That's not the basis of their Judaism. Which meant that for people like us, that is rabbis, our task changed from you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and I will interpret for you the things that you need to do, to this is why it's good for you to do it. Not you have to do it because God said, but it's good for you. And so we become enmeshed in this sort of vast number of reasons why it's good to keep kosher, it's good to keep Shabbos, it's good for the Jews to care for each other, it's good to have a state of Israel, good. I mean, we always have to explain why it's good, why we find it good, why your kids will benefit from this, why your family will benefit from this. And as soon as you change to it's good, you have opened up a huge category of arguable. Because if I say it's good for you, they can say, but you know what? Actually, it's better for our family to do this.
Right.
It's actually nicer for us to go to the beach than to go to shul. Right. It's more bonding for us to go to a restaurant on Saturday afternoon than to stay home. And so you're in a very different category, and it's an extremely difficult one to defend. And it doesn't matter what reason you give, whether it's your reason about how community serving others and so on is so uplifting. So if you say serving others, they'll say, yeah, I serve others because I work, at a soup kitchen, or because I'm part of United Way, or because I work in leukemia lymphoma. There are lots of every value we have. There are secular ways of realizing it, except the value of being Jewish. So it's a much more difficult task than it once was, and the numbers reflect that.
Yeah. By the way, this is the thing that Maimonides and others were quite anxious about in terms of Tamei Mitzvot, the whole idea of hooking the mitzvah to any kind of a
reason
and a rationale.
Right, because as soon as you say kashrut is for health, but I can be, as Harold Kushner once said, you can get just as sick eating a bad chicken as you can a bad pig. So
Right. I think, but the question I suppose is, I would say that, and I wrote to you a little bit about this afterwards, this notion of Judaism by invitation, which I know is a form of encouragement, but the fundamental difference for me in the way I try to advance it in the community that I'm fortunate enough to serve is that invitation, I think, actually invites a person to feel, and appropriately so, that they are the initiator, that they are the one who's actually sort of stirring this. It's an invitation that they can accept or decline. I do think one other factor comes into play, David, and that is this notion that if the reasons have less to do with what benefits you and more to do with what benefits something larger than you and more lasting than you, then I wonder whether it's peoplehood. We're talking about the safety of Israel. We're talking about lots of causes that you could still argue there are other ways to do that.
Right.
But you could also retort that these are pretty reliable ways to do it, since they've sort of have us hanging around for the last 4,000 years or so.
So what you're saying, which I agree with, is that there are certain strategies that are likely to be more successful than others. But it's still on the side of you should do this because you're still in the world of because.
Yeah.
And there are better becauses and worse becauses, but they're all becauses. So I agree with you. Service to the Jewish community and the fact that the world needs the Jews, which I actually believe they do, as few as we are, that idea is a very powerful one. And the notion that contributing to, the longest continuous tradition in the world that teaches people how to grow their souls, that's a very powerful one. But it's not as comprehensive and certain as the creator of the universe said you have to do this.
Yeah.
So we're in different territory.
Do you think that we're possibly a little oversimplifying the obligatory perspective? In other words, I think you're right that if the fact that it comes from divine authority is a key point. However, of course, and I think you allude to this in the piece, and you certainly know that there are lots of shades in that category too, right? In the same way that there are lots of shades of.
Yes, I'm absolutely oversimplifying it without question on both sides, but I'm doing it in order to make a point about what I think is a really significant shift. So if you ask yourself, for example, why ultra-Orthodox communities tend to do well with retention. They have a bigger falling away rate than people think, but they tend to do pretty well with retention. It's in part because of the tight-knitness of the community, but it's also because of the theological clarity of we're doing God's will.
Right.
And it feels, let me just also say, it feels really good to feel like you're living in harmony with what the creator of the universe wants you to do.
Yes.
So it's not a negative. It's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. No doubt. I do want to go to this notion of a little further on this question of the idea of the freedom that essentially is the backdrop for all of this. The notion that Jews are free, people are free to be free of faith or to adopt it, right? You have this wonderful statement that goes back into your book, I think, of Why Be Jewish, that I love, that says to be chosen isn't to be better than others. It's to be called to be better than one currently is. And
I really do believe that. And I mean, also, by the way, about chosenness, I may have told you this story. So if I did, forgive me for repeating it, but I loved this. So my brother is a professor at Emory. And the Dalai Lama, believe it or not, is a professor at Emory. Now he doesn't travel, but for a while he used to travel and teach at Emory. So when my brother and I met in India when I was on sabbatical, and he had brought a bunch of students to Dharamsala. And so he and I and his wife had a private audience with the Dalai Lama for I don't know, a good half hour or so. And it was wonderful. He's like a truly self-effacing, delightful, wise man. And he was great with the students. But at the beginning of the audience, literally at the beginning, the three of us sit down, he looks at me and he goes, "What's this about the chosenness?" And I, just like that. And I said, "You're right. Jews do feel like they're a chosen people." I said, "But I think we're not the only ones who feel that way. And we believe God can choose lots of people for lots of different things." And he laughed and he said, "You're right. Tibetans think we're chosen too." So I think if most people are honest with themselves, they have this sort of ethnic pride, like Italians are very special, or Irish are very special, the English are special, or the Albanians are special. We all think that. It's just the Jews got this bad rap because we whisper it to the world, I guess what. But I think that the idea of chosenness is exactly that, which is we have this relationship. It does not actually define your relationship. I have no idea what kind of relationship the Tibetans have with God or with whatever it is that they conceive of as God. I just know what Jews have. So it calls us to do what it is that Jews are supposed to do without in any way diminishing the fact that other people obviously have purposes and missions in this world, as individuals also do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, first of all, I love that story. I had not heard that story. And I think that I want to just push now away from the chosen idea, but to the free idea, this idea of constantly trying to be better than we currently are. I think that classically we have this debate that exists between free will and fate, between the idea that we can make choices that we will make, or that somehow, since our genes and where our parents and our IQ points and all these other things weren't things that we actually chose, we might come to the conclusion very, very easily that the freedom is not as real as we are at least taught it is, again and again through the Jewish calendar. Personal freedom on the high holiday season, collective freedom at the Pesach season, and pretty much everywhere in between we're reminded of this. Lately, I've been thinking that it's the wrong dichotomy, and I wonder if you'd comment on this, that really what life is about trying to again and again become free. That it's not simply is it fated, or do we have that freedom to choose, but that again and again, and this goes to your quote, to constantly try to be better than one currently is. Every time we can make a choice, we, on the one level, we bank it and we then continue to become free. But on another level, we might find ourselves back in a position where we inadvertently become unfree.
So I mean, it's a fascinating point and could open a large subject, because we make choices that free us and we make choices that enslave us, and we know that. And then we make choices that do both, like having children, which both enslaves you and frees you. That is, it frees you to do certain things that you could never do without a child, and yet it also confines you in ways you would never be confined if you didn't have a child. I have my assistant rabbis, Rabbi Guzik and Sherman. They have little kids at home, and I live with my daughter who's 24. And I always say to them, when they say, "Oh, you're doing so and you seem busy," I always say, "There's no such thing as busy if you don't have small children." Because when I go home, I will actually, if I decide to do something, I can do it, but you can't. So there are these decisions. On the other hand, the notion of part of our life is a progressive desire to become free is, I agree with you, a very Jewish notion. As long as we understand, which I think the tradition does, that freedom doesn't mean you don't obligate yourself to things. Freedom doesn't mean you do anything you want. Freedom means you make conscious choices about the obligations you choose. So you can freely choose to be kosher, and then you will never eat something that's non-kosher for the rest of your life, which is, and to just illustrate how powerful that is, our colleague, Joseph Telushkin, once made this fantastic point to me that I actually never thought of, but it's really remarkable. He said, "I know people who are overweight and they desperately try to lose weight, and they would do anything, and they know it's bad for their health, and the doctor tells them they have to, and they so on, and they still eat the last piece of cake. But they would never touch something that wasn't kosher. If that last piece of cake had something in it that wasn't kosher, it would be no problem for them not to eat it," which is a remarkable thing. In other words, they have obligated themselves, which is a free choice, but it still constricts their freedom.
Yeah, fascinating. No, it is a larger subject, but I mean, fundamentally, what we're about tonight on Shavuot, it gets articulated actually at a local law school, that when they graduate their students, they essentially say, you are now prepared to be as custodians of those wise constraints that make us free. That is a very Jewish definition of law.
I love that.
And it is this again, this notion of moving from freedom from to freedom for. and and the way in which people obligate themselves. I would argue, going back to the earlier conversation about Judaism by encouragement, that very often that encouragement comes from the peer group, and the notion that you're surrounded by others, and you depend, that others depend on you, you depend on them, and that dependence may not be a divine, infallible voice that's coming through on that frequency, but it's nevertheless felt very, very palpably as a kind of a self-adopted obligation.
So I don't know whether, I mean, I just opened, there's a question on the Q&A, and it's one that I actually think is really important and would like to address.
Please.
Which is basically from Robert Nissenbaum, where it's just basically, there's a prelude about how various groups fight each other. Then he says, what is it about us humans that turns people against others with such hate and even wishing them dead?
Yes.
And so here's what I would say. There's also another question that just appeared, but I'm going to let you read it while I at least respond to this one. I don't know, answering may be too big a. Anybody who thinks that people are just basically good ought to visit a playground. Because what happens when a new kid comes onto the playground? Did the other kids go, oh, look, a new child, let us share our toys? No, they say, let's get the new kid. There is built into human beings this reciprocal love of my own, which also means not love of the other. And this is I would say, if you boiled it down, this is the great struggle of human history, is how do you love your own without hating the other? Now, the problem is universal love doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because everyone knows that you have to have certain obligations and feelings to that which is close. And I will never feel about your children the way I feel about my own child. I won't. But that's really important because my own child needs a special level of care at a certain point. Somebody's got to provide. So Judaism's answer is one God created all of us. And therefore, there is a principle that ties everyone together. And even your enemy is in the image of God. But it is a struggle to achieve that level, and very few spirits do it. But I think that the question is almost more, how is it that we have this miracle of love of the other, then why do we have hate of the other? The hate is almost natural from the time you're young, the people that you know and the people that you don't know. People that you don't know, you're suspicious of. It's like evolutionarily tied into us. We were tribes, other tribes came along, we were suspicious. But we can transcend it. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And I want to say that even though America right now is going through a clear phase of tribalism and division, it's also a grand experiment in how do we create a unity of people who are very unlike without forcing them all to be the same. Because most nations, for most of history, it's why the Jews were always on the outs. And it's one of the reasons why Jews have done better in America. There were the Russians and the Jews, the Germans and the Jews, the Poles and the Jews, but there aren't the Americans and the Jews. We're a salad. And so in that sense, America is a vast and wonderful experiment that we're still struggling with.
Right. The next question, by the way, in the Q&A is related to this notion of that kind of certainty. I want to come to it in a minute. I do want to just at least touch on one of the 10 commandments that I promised I would. You had a wonderful comment years ago that I have actually continued to adopt and adapt, which is the notion that the 10th of the 10 commandments, which is all about emotion, is not so much a commandment as it is a consequence. And that is to say, if one, I think the way you put it, or the way I would put it, particularly if you handle the long ones, that is, of the 10 commandments, the longest ones deal with idols and various forms of idolatry, and the way we handle Shabbat and time. And I think Heschel, people would be disappointed if I didn't quote Heschel at least once in every 10 minutes.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Heschel, I think, says that, history is this sort of parade of through history of idols worshipped and idols smashed, right? That's sort of what we find. But if you adhere to the first 9, if you refrain from harming others, if you have a sense of a relationship with God, if you avoid falsehood, if you avoid idolizing things, right? I love
Right.
when they used to take us through archaeological digs in Israel, and they would tell us that the idols in antiquity were roughly the size of cell phones. And right, it's just perfect, right? In terms of
Yeah.
what our screen time today, and and the and you use your time well enough to retain a degree of independence from all those things, 1/7 of your week, then it's a promise, as you say, you will not covet.
Right.
So
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 this was from Iture Torah. It was a Hasidic comment that when I saw it, like you, I thought it was wonderful. That it's a promise that you won't covet because your life will be so full that you won't, that you won't want that which someone else has, and and that's I mean I think to some extent we do experience that. That is for most people, not for everybody, but for most people, as your life gets better, you feel your sort of envy of someone else who has something reducing. And so if you feel satisfied inside, it is possible, I hope, to feel that.
yeah, yeah. I do want to touch on at least a couple other things, and then we'll maybe go to some of the other questions that are coming. We have about just about 15 minutes or so, a little more than that left. So I want to touch on COVID because you've had some really wonderful things in your collection of inspiring moments. The COVID collection that you've been doing for what, 16 months or
Yeah,
since it
something like
began.
that. Yeah.
And I think that one of the questions I'm just kind of curious about, I hear a lot of people hypothesize about what will keep. And I wonder if that isn't more wishful thinking than reality. That is, you like to say that one of the nice things about Judaism is that you get to look back before you have to, right? So looking back, as we will to roughly now, but what do we really think? Because on one level, somebody said to me last week, in a conversation, they said, most of us don't like to look back at painful times. We don't like to dwell on it. We don't like to go back into it. As soon as we can extricate ourselves out of it, we're pretty much put it behind us, right? What do you think, David Wolpe? What do you think of that is actually going to be something that either you're going to want to keep or that we're going to want to keep, that we really believe we'll want to keep, as opposed to kind of wish we will?
So I think that those stories about how it doesn't matter whether you win a lottery or lose a limb. In the end, you come to the same emotional level. I don't want to necessarily speak for the truth of that, but I think that's true for societies in general. That is, I think we will probably end up being, assuming that there isn't another incidence of this, being quite similar to what we were before, with some differences. And I think one of the big differences is what we see right now, which is you can have guests from remote stuff that's not going to go away. I mean, there were so many times when I got on a plane to speak at various places where I think now they'll say, look, you don't want to spend 2 days and a flight and all of that. You want to just get on the computer and just talk for a while, and I'll probably say yes. So which is a huge change. It means that people will stay a little more put when it comes to the business meetings and so on, and working remotely. That's not going to change. A lot of people left Silicon Valley because they realized, hey, I can do this from Santa Fe, New Mexico, just as easily. And that's a big shift. But in terms of our spiritual selves, the only thing that might be retained, especially in those who are younger, which usually doesn't come to you till you're much older, is the recognition that life can change in an instant. And everybody who gets older finds that out at some point. But I think when you're young, you really do have this sense of like endless vistas and everything is going to be fine and everything is going to be the same. And nobody who lived through this, I think, will be able to forget that, although I'm not sure whether that will be an intergenerational sense. Next generation may not,
Yeah,
who knows?
it's a very, very important point that I had not thought of, and I'm grateful for you raising it tonight. I do think that handled well, it becomes an example of something where, which is what I tend to think faith and reliability is all about, which is you've done this before, you can do this again. That's
Right.
basically what I tell my Israeli friends, right?
Yeah.
You've been to the precipice of despair before, right? During the second intifada,
Yes.
when you were wondering whether it was even going to be
Right.
possible to take a bus or have a meal in a public place or worry about people coming home safe and sound at the end of the night.
Yeah.
And yet you manage that. Now you have it erupting in the mixed cities, and you're wondering whether this whole idea of 20% of the Israeli population is going to be able to truly be trusted. You've done it before. You've faced this before, and you've done it, and you can do it again. I hope that's the lesson we take from the idea that life can change in an instant.
I hope so. George Eliot has a wonderful quote about this. She said, childhood is soothed by no memories of outlived sorrow. In other words, when you're a little kid and something bad happens, you think it's going to stay forever. But it doesn't stay forever. And when you're older, you know that. You say, I'm sorry that you broke up with this boy, but you'll get over it. And they think, no, I'll never get over it. But you've gotten over it. And so you know that people get over it. And so I think maybe this will contribute to the idea that something terrible can happen. And you know what? You can get over it. And society can move on. Because there were people at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sort of constitutionally, I admit this, okay? Full confession, I'm constitutionally optimistic. I always think things are going to be fine, which is infuriating to people around me. Drives them nuts. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there were people who said it's going to go on for years and years. It's going to be terrible, and we're never going to. And I thought it'll be okay. We'll make it through. Somehow we'll make it through. I think that's a good lesson.
Yeah, I agree. I want to go to one of the questions also in the Q&A. Let's see, Karen has asked, what can I say to a Jewish friend who expresses disdain for Israel's, quote, oppression? I want to engage in conversation and not leave him in his social bubble. Those who come from the left are quite sure they are correct. And that's Karen Farber.
So I would actually, I think that last observation is really important. And what I would say is, if I had such a friend, and I know many such people and have some of whom I suppose are friends, and what I would say is, are you willing to actually engage in a conversation about this? Do you want to hear a different point of view? Because if not, then the answer is there's nothing you can say. Just like there are certain things I believe that it doesn't matter what someone says to me. It's like when a missionary comes to the door. I think, look, you can talk for the rest of the day. You're not going to make me not Jewish. I know this. So it's almost not worth your wasting your breath. If that's the way they feel, then this is not, then you're trying to convince them. So the other thing I would say is Adam Grant has done a lot of interesting work on how to persuade people that they're wrong about stuff. And it almost never is by persuading people that they're wrong about stuff. It's by listening to them.
Yes.
Listening to what they have to say, understanding their concerns, and creating some kind of bond so that you can discuss.
100%, 100%. Very wise. And listening for the feelings, right? Because fundamentally, that's what's going on. It's really very, very much about what's going on in terms of the depth of the feeling, which I want to bring around to one more point. My dad, of blessed memory, who I have less than 2 months left on Kaddish to honor him this year. He and I had this conversation. I was telling him I had just read a book by the New York Times TV critic on the history of our immediate past president, who actually I've not talked about at all. People in my community know by name for the last 6 years, but it was all about his relationship with the television, the light, right? That tells you you're on camera, and the way in which his whole life has been defined by that from very, very young age, growing up in Queens, and how much that reading Panawisek's book about him actually gave me a completely different perspective that I found enormously refreshing. And I remember my father saying to me, "Well, that's great, Will." He called me Will. He said, "That's great, Will." He said, "But what good does it do you?" And it was, how's it actually helping? Or another example would be reading Eula Biss's book about vaccination and inoculation, which is a really wonderful read on the history of why people, she wrote it in 2014, long before COVID, have real issues around putting something inside their body that the government shouldn't be involved in their body. It has to do with right agency, all kinds of other things. Or a great example would be reading a book about online life by Nicholas Carr and the effect that it has
Right.
on our brains. My dad would say on all these, he would say, "What good does it do? How does it help?" And my answer, which he liked, was, "It keeps me sane." Right. In other words, it actually,
So funny.
in other words, if I can keep from becoming utterly unglued by the emotions that are really in play on the part of somebody else who
Right.
is so certain, right? Then at least I stay fresh enough to try to stay awake for opportunities for engagement that I would
So
otherwise not find possible, where I'd be completely hung out to
I
dry.
think that's a great answer. I would have given three other answers.
Yeah,
One is sometimes as somebody who reads a wide variety of stuff, a lot of it's just interesting and entertaining. And being interested and entertained is not negligible. The second is, as a rabbi, you never know when you're going to come across something in a book that you can use in a sermon. Everything that you can watch a cartoon and come across an example for a sermon. I once used The Simpsons in a sermon. I mean, you never know. So everything. And the third is everything you read has the potential to change the way that you look at the world. And that also is, I mean, you now understand people who don't want to be vaccinated better than you did before you read the book.
yeah.
So it changes your empathy and understanding. So I think there's almost, what I would say is, if I could like wave a magic wand and change society in one direction, I would get people to read more books. So I'm all for it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'm just having a look here. Oh, it's looks like a member of your mishpacha, Sharon Diamond, has a question.
It is a member of my mishpacha. Hello, Sharon. I wondered if you would ask. Yes.
Do you think that having hybrid style services, meaning occasional Zoom, will be adopted as we move forward? Some services have had much greater participation on Zoom.
So first of all, it's wonderful to hear from you, as it always is. I would say I tried to get our congregation to broadcast our services, and they were very resistant, which I totally understood. This was years ago, so I dropped the effort. Now that we have done, and we get thousands of people who watch, I don't think there's any going back. I don't see how you all of a sudden say, all those people who've been watching our services, now we're cutting you off because now we have people in the sanctuary. So yeah, I think that change is here to stay. I hope in the end that it will be a good change, but I think it's almost an inevitable one.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, I would agree. And that's certainly something we at KI are going to be continuing to do. We're going to make it more and more, I should say, less and less central to the experience, so that when people are present physically in the not too distant future, as we've seen increasingly is the case, they will not be aware. It won't be a dominant
Right.
part of the experience, the in-person experience. And this goes to a question about how Judaism and Jewish expression and Jewish life is going to have changed because of COVID. And I think, yes, in terms of learning, like right now, also in terms of the ways that we celebrate, also in terms of the ways that we simply connect in the Jewish world. I mean, my gosh, right now, one can, with a save the time difference, be in contact, realizes that one can be in contact with people in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv,
Right.
anywhere with simply a click, which of course we knew intellectually before, but this has become all the more clear.
Yeah, the enormity of the reach and the possibility of getting to people who, by the way, otherwise would not have a service, whether they're in underserved communities or they're in old age homes or they're in hospitals or whatever the situation may be, they're shut-ins. It seems as strange as it seemed to do it, it now seems cruel to stop doing it.
Yep. I have one more question from another, and then I'm going to bring us home to the under the wire, as it were. So this is from Monik, who's a student who's learning with me and our community. And she asks, how should we approach conflicts between the obligations placed on us through Judaism and the realities we face in the modern world? What standards should we use to make these decisions to keep it from becoming a keep what we like and get rid of what we don't situation?
Ask your rabbi.
That's for next week, Monica.
So I think I'm going to give you an answer that's not entirely satisfactory, but that's because all of modern Judaism is an attempt to answer that question. So I don't think that any single answer will do. But for me, it's actually all about your trajectory. That is, if you keep doing more, whatever that means, and Judaism is filled with endless possibilities for doing more. If you don't say Modeh Ani when you first wake up in the morning, you start saying it, and that this month is what you have. And you don't light Shabbos candles, or you don't stay home on Shabbos, or you don't keep kosher, and there are all sorts of gradations of the way you can get to keeping kosher, or you don't participate, or you don't read a Jewish book or Jewish magazine, or you don't study something, or on and on and on. As long as your trajectory is towards more, as Franz Rosenzweig famously said, he said, when someone asks you if you perform a certain mitzvah, don't say no. He said, say not yet. But you have to mean it. You can't go around your whole life saying not yet, not yet, not yet, and not do anything. But if you do, then I think you have every right to feel like you're on the path, on the derech. It's called halakha. It's called walking. It's not called destination.
Yep. Very nice. And I would just add that in terms of everything that you've said tonight, which there's been a tremendous amount that is quite profound, that if we could just come back to this role of Sinai, we talked about the idea of continuing to read. We talked about the idea of continuing to grow. We talked about this notion that the voice, continues, and we continue to find an invisible God audible.
Yeah.
And I think that you quoted George Eliot before, so everybody in the community knows that the only novel I've read that I keep reading now is Daniel Deronda, and that and she mentions a beautiful notion. She says, she talks about a breath of divine thought, a breath of divine thought, and I think that in a very, very real sense, lahavdil, on a much more solemn and sacred note, that's what now stands before us as we stand before it, and prepared to not only keep from ourselves sane in a very, very tumultuous time that's full of travail, but also find ourselves freshening up a good deal as a result.
Right. So, first of all, I want all of your congregants to know it was great to stand with Rabbi Hamilton at Sinai. 2,000 years ago, since we were all at Sinai together, which means our friendship is really old. But and also, by the way, although I read Daniel Deronda, I enjoyed it, although it took a little bit of work to get through it. My favorite novel of all time is Middlemarch, which I've read, I don't know, 5 or 6 times, and is just an extraordinary work of genius. If you've never read Middlemarch, I can't recommend it strongly enough. But I think that it's true that one of the things that we've lost a little bit is the Jewish mystical / spiritual sense, that there's something about being the recipients of Torah that is magical, and that there's a reason why it endured. We return to it again and again and again and again. I just taught this thing for the Rabbinical Assembly about on Shavuot about revelation being an act of love, and it's the way that God shows love for us. Because I'll just close with this. One of the things that I said was, Rabbi Akiva says it's with great love that God created human beings in God's image, but it's with even greater love that God told them that they were created in God's image. It's the communication that is the essence of love. And Torah is this collaboration between God and human beings, and therefore an expression of our love for one another.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want to say I love it, and I mean it. And David Wolpe, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you. A great pleasure. It always is a great pleasure. So
thank you,
thanks.
thank you. Wish you a Chag Shavuot Sameach, and again, truly touched by your presence and moved by your message tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Sameach.